Hey there, welcome back.
It's good to be back.
We've gotten a lot of requests lately to take a deep dive into this mandate for leadership.
Yeah, this one's been making waves.
Yeah, and specifically, people are asking about the recommendations for reshaping the government. Like, how would a conservative administration actually put these ideas into practice?
Well, they definitely don't shy away from specifics. We're talking detailed plans for restructuring departments, overhauling agencies, the whole nine yards.
And you know what? I think a good place to start might be, well, like right at the beginning,
Mhm.
pages 100 to 200.
Right, where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, because that's where they really get into the nuts and bolts of how they'd transform these big federal departments and agencies.
Exactly, and it gets pretty interesting right away. You see this underlying tension right off the bat.
Wow.
While they're kind of wary of concentrated power in the executive branch, but at the same time, they want a strong president.
Makes sense. It's kind of like a classic conservative dilemma, right?
Yeah, totally. And they actually say, and I quote, that the next conservative president should be willing to bend or break the bureaucracy.
Wow. Bend or break. That's pretty strong language.
It is. They're not mincing words, are they?
So how do they reconcile those two ideas? Wanting to limit executive power, but also wanting a president who's not afraid to use it, forcefully.
Well, their argument is that the bureaucracy, the federal bureaucracy, has become this kind of unaccountable, sprawling entity,
Oh, I see. Yeah.
and it's strayed from its intended purpose.
So they see a powerful executive as the key to what? Taming the beast.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. They want to shrink the government, rein in the bureaucracy, and return power to, the states, to families, to communities.
Okay, so it's about shifting that balance of power. Makes sense.
Right, less Washington, more Main Street, that sort of thing.
Gotcha. So they lay out their vision for like overhauling specific departments.
They do, and they get very specific.
Okay, so where should we start?
Well, they have a whole section on Homeland Security, and it's not exactly a glowing review.
Really? Like they don't like DHS.
They call it bloated, inefficient, even suggest potentially shrinking or dismantling it.
Whoa, dismantling DHS? Is that even possible?
Well, it depends on what they mean by dismantling. They might not be talking about completely abolishing it, but they definitely want to see it significantly restructured.
Okay, so what's the thinking there?
Their argument is that DHS has kind of lost its way. It's strayed from its core mission,
There's this.
preventing terrorism. Right. That was the whole reason DHS was created after 9/11.
All right, right.
And they argue that it's become too focused on things like immigration enforcement.
And they see that as what, a distraction.
Yeah, they think it's a misallocation of resources, that DHS should be laser focused on preventing terrorism and less involved in, other areas.
Okay, so that's Homeland Security. What about immigration specifically? I know they have a lot to say about that.
Oh, yeah. They specifically call out USCIS, the agency that handles citizenship and immigration services.
Right, USCIS.
And they claim it's become an open borders agency.
Whoa, open borders. That's pretty loaded language.
Yeah, it is. It reflects their view that the current system is too lax, that it's not doing enough to screen and vet immigrants.
So what do they actually propose?
Well, their reforms are all about shifting USCIS back to its original focus,
Which are
screening and vetting immigrants, making sure that only those who meet certain criteria are allowed to enter and stay in the country.
so stricter vetting, more emphasis on national security, that kind of thing.
Exactly. It's a stark contrast to, the current emphasis on easing asylum eligibility and removing barriers to immigration.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a major point of contention.
Absolutely. And this hardline stance on immigration, you see it extending to their views on the intelligence community as well.
Oh, really? How so?
They're calling for a major overhaul, arguing that the intelligence community is still stuck in, a Cold War mindset.
Stuck in the past.
Yeah, and they say it's ill-equipped to handle new and emerging threats, especially from China.
China's definitely their big boogeyman, isn't it?
It is. They see China as the biggest threat facing the U.S. right now, and they argue that the entire government needs to be reoriented to meet that challenge.
That's a pretty dramatic shift in focus.
It is. And they propose some pretty radical ideas.
Like what?
Like requiring every high school student to take the ASVAB,
The ASVAB, the military entrance exam.
the one and only, and they want to make it mandatory for all high school students, regardless of whether they're planning to enlist.
Wow, that's I mean, that's a pretty bold move.
It is. They argue it's necessary to boost military recruitment and address concerns about declining enlistment rates.
I guess they're really serious about this whole preparing for a showdown with China thing.
Oh, yeah, they see it as an existential threat. And they argue that the U.S. needs to be prepared to fight and win a war against China if necessary.
Okay, so a very proactive, maybe even aggressive approach to national security.
That's a good way to put it. They're not messing around.
All right, so we've talked about Homeland Security, immigration, intelligence.
Hitting all the hot button issues.
Right, right. So what's next on the agenda?
Well, let's talk about the USDA.
The Department of Agriculture. What do they have to say about that?
They basically want to hit the reset button, take the USDA back to what they consider its core mission,
Which is?
supporting American farmers and ranchers, and crucially, ensuring an abundance of affordable food.
Okay, that sounds pretty straightforward. What's controversial about that?
Well, they're very critical of the current administration's focus on climate change.
Oh, right, the whole green agriculture thing.
Yeah, exactly. And equity within the food system, all that.
And they see those as distractions.
Yeah, they argue that the USDA shouldn't be focused on those things, that its priorities should be efficient agricultural production and keeping food costs down.
So a very production-oriented, traditional view of agriculture.
Exactly. Back to basics. That's their motto.
Okay, I can see how that would rub some people the wrong way.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely a departure from the current approach.
Makes sense. All right, so we've got Homeland Security, immigration, intelligence, agriculture. What else is on their hit list?
Well, education is another big one.
Oh, right, right. They want to, abolish the Department of Education, right?
Well, not quite abolish it, but they do advocate for a major downsizing.
Okay, so what would that look like?
They want to see a lot of its programs either shifted to other agencies or returned to the states.
So more local control, less federal involvement.
That's the idea. They believe that education policy should be driven by parents, not bureaucrats.
A classic conservative argument.
It is, and they're big proponents of school choice, giving parents more options for where to send their kids.
Right, vouchers, charter schools, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And they also want to strengthen legal protections for parental rights in education.
So giving parents more say in what their kids are being taught.
Precisely. They believe that parents should have the ultimate authority over their children's education.
It's interesting, isn't it? This whole idea of empowering individuals and families, taking power away from the federal government, it seems to be a recurring theme in their approach.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like a thread that runs through all of their proposals.
And it's very evident in their approach to trade policy as well, especially when it comes to China.
Oh, yeah. They have a whole section on trade that reads like it was written by, Peter Navarro.
Peter Navarro, the trade warrior from the previous administration.
The one and only. They're very skeptical of free trade agreements, especially with China.
So a pretty big departure from traditional free trade conservatism.
It is. And they advocate for a much more aggressive approach, one that prioritizes protecting American jobs and countering what they see as unfair trade practices by China.
So tariffs, import quotas, that kind of thing.
Exactly. They want to get tough on China, use every tool at their disposal to protect American economic interests.
It's a pretty significant shift in thinking within the Republican Party.
It is. And it reflects a growing sense of unease about the impact of globalization and, the rise of China.
It's definitely a sign of the times.
It is. And it shows how, the Republican Party is evolving, trying to adapt to a changing world.
So we've seen how they want to reshape a few key departments.
And we're just getting started.
Right. I mean, this is just a taste of what they have in store for the federal government.
This is just the tip of the iceberg.
So where do we go from here?
Well, next time we'll delve into their plans for other big departments like energy, the EPA, HHS, justice, you name it.
Oh boy, sounds like we've got a lot more to unpack.
We do. And trust me, it's going to be a wild ride.
All right, buckle up, everyone. We'll be right back with more from Mandate for Leadership.
It's going to be good. All right, so we're back.
Back for more deep diving.
Into the Mandate for Leadership.
This thing is dense, I'm telling you.
It is, packed with ideas.
Yeah, so last time, we kind of set the stage, right? Their whole philosophy of government.
Right. Less government, more individual liberty.
Exactly. And we got a glimpse of how they'd approach a few key areas.
Homeland Security, immigration, intelligence.
Yep, the big ones.
The big ones, but there's so much more.
And today we're going to dive into, what? Healthcare, housing.
Yeah, let's talk about healthcare first. I mean, that's always a hot topic.
Always
And this document, it really zeroes in on Medicare and Medicaid.
a big two.
Yeah, the giants of the American healthcare system.
Pretty much everyone's affected by those programs, right?
Yeah, either directly or
Like,
indirectly.
you're either on them or you're paying for it.
Both.
Or both.
So they argue that the current system, it's well-intentioned, but ultimately unsustainable.
The classic unsustainable argument.
Yeah, you hear that a lot, especially given, rising healthcare costs.
Yeah, that's a big concern for a lot of people.
Huge concern. And they propose some pretty big changes.
Okay, like what?
Well, their approach, it's all about empowering patients, promoting choice.
Okay, I'm hearing some conservative buzzwords here.
You are, but the key is, controlling those costs.
Right.
And they argue that the federal government, it shouldn't be dictating everything.
So less Washington, more.
More state control, more flexibility for states to experiment.
Okay, so it's that whole devolution of power thing again.
Exactly. They believe that different states have different needs.
Makes sense.
And that a one-size-fits-all approach from the federal government it doesn't work.
So they want to give states more power to design their own healthcare programs.
Exactly. They believe that could lead to more efficient and effective programs overall.
Okay, but how would that actually work?
Well, they propose some pretty significant changes to how Medicare and Medicaid are financed.
Okay, like what?
They throw around terms like block grants, per capita caps.
Oh boy, getting into the weeds here.
I know. It gets pretty technical. But basically, they want to give states more control over their healthcare budgets.
Okay, so instead of the federal government just handing out money based on how much states spend.
Right, which is how it works now.
They want to give them a fixed amount and say, like, here you go, figure it out.
Yeah, something like that. They argue it would incentivize states to be more fiscally responsible, to find creative ways to cut costs.
Okay, I could see the logic there.
Right. And some people argue that it could lead to more innovation, states trying new things, seeing what works.
Right. But of course, there's always the other side of the coin.
There is. Critics worry that it could lead to cuts in services,
Yeah, like states just deciding they can't afford to provide certain benefits anymore.
Or that it could make it harder for people to access care, especially low-income folks.
Right. Those are definitely valid concerns.
They are. And this is one of those areas where the devil is really in the details.
Yeah, how these changes are actually implemented would make a huge difference.
A huge difference. And it's something that, would have to be very carefully considered.
Okay, so beyond just the financing of Medicare and Medicaid.
Right. They also delve into some more specific programs within HHS.
HHS.
The Department of Health and Human Services, the big umbrella agency for all things health-related.
Right.
And they talk about a range of issues, from welfare to family planning.
Oh, boy. More hot-button topic.
I know, right? They want to see stricter work requirements for welfare programs like TANF. Temporary assistance for needy families. It's basically cash assistance for low-income families.
Okay, got it.
And they argue that states shouldn't be able to just waive those work requirements willy-nilly.
So more emphasis on work, personal responsibility, that sort of thing.
Exactly. It's a very conservative approach to welfare.
Makes sense. And what about family planning? They tend to have strong opinions on that as well.
Oh, yeah, they do. They want to make sure that federal funds don't go to organizations that provide abortions.
So defunding Planned Parenthood, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. They're very much opposed to abortion.
And they want to make sure that taxpayer dollars aren't being used to fund something they see as morally wrong.
Exactly. It's a reflection of their pro-life stance.
Okay, that's a pretty consistent position for them.
It is very consistent, and you see it reflected in their views on sex education as well.
Oh yeah, how so?
They're big proponents of locally controlled sex education.
So less federal involvement, more parental control.
Exactly. They want to give parents the ultimate say in what their kids are being taught about sex.
Okay, so that's HHS. What's next?
Well, let's talk about HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development.
HUD, yeah, they're the ones who provide housing assistance, right?
Right. They oversee a lot of programs aimed at, helping low-income families find affordable housing.
Okay, and what do they want to do with HUD?
Well, their vision for HUD is it's pretty much in line with their overall philosophy.
Right.
Less government, more local control.
Right.
They want to streamline programs, give more power to local communities.
Okay, so basically they want to shrink HUD's role.
Yeah, they argue that HUD has become too bureaucratic, too inefficient.
And that a lot of its programs are just not working.
Exactly. They believe that state and local governments are better equipped to, understand the specific housing needs of their communities.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about, like, the argument that you need federal oversight to ensure fairness, to prevent discrimination?
They address that. They say that, a lot of HUD's regulations, they actually end up hurting the people they're supposed to help.
Oh, how so?
Well, they argue that a lot of these regulations, they actually drive up housing costs, make it harder to build affordable housing.
Okay, so their argument is that less regulation would actually lead to more affordable housing.
Yeah, that's their thinking. They believe that the market can do a better job of providing affordable housing than the government can.
Okay, that's a pretty bold claim.
It is, and it's certainly debatable.
Yeah, I can see that being a pretty contentious issue.
Absolutely. It's one of those areas where, reasonable people can disagree.
Right, right. Okay, so that's HUD. What's next on our list?
Let's talk about the Interior Department.
The Interior, yeah, they're the ones who manage all the federal lands,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, all those national parks, forests, all that.
And they're usually in the news because of environmental issues.
Yeah, drilling, mining, endangered species, all that stuff.
So what do they want to do with the interior?
Well, let's just say they have a very different vision from the current administration.
Okay, like how so?
They're very pro-development, very pro-energy extraction.
So more drilling, more mining, more logging.
Yeah, pretty much. They want to open up federal lands to more resource extraction.
They see it as a way to, what, boost the economy?
Yeah. And reduce our dependence on foreign energy sources.
Makes sense. I mean, that's a pretty common argument.
It is. They argue that the U.S. has abundant natural resources and we should be using them.
Okay, but that's obviously going to run into some opposition from environmental groups.
Oh, yeah. There's no doubt about that. This would be a very controversial move.
I can only imagine.
They also want to, streamline the environmental review process.
Right, the whole, like, getting permits and all that.
Yeah, all that.
Yeah.
They argue it's too cumbersome, too time-consuming.
And that it's holding back, important projects.
Yeah, they believe it's stifling economic growth.
Okay, so a very different approach to environmental policy.
Very different. Much more focused on, economic development.
And less on, like, conservation and preservation.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, so that's the Interior. What else? What other departments are on their hit list?
Well, let's talk about the Department of Justice.
The DOJ. Oh, yeah, that's always a big one.
Always. And they want to see a DOJ that focuses on what they see as its core functions.
Which are?
Enforcing the law, protecting constitutional rights, safeguarding national security.
Okay, sounds pretty straightforward. But I'm sure there's more to it than that.
Oh, yeah. There's always more to it. They're very concerned about what they see as politicized prosecutions.
Oh, like they think the DOJ has been used to target conservatives.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They believe that the DOJ has become too politicized in recent years.
And they want to depoliticize it.
That's their goal. They want to make sure that the DOJ is focused on, actual law breaking, not on going after people for their political beliefs.
Okay, that's a pretty ambitious goal. How do they propose to achieve that?
Well, they have a number of ideas. One of them is limiting the FBI's involvement in combating what they call misinformation and disinformation.
Oh, that's a tricky area.
It is. They argue that the FBI has overstepped its bounds in this area, that its efforts to combat misinformation have often been used to, censor conservative viewpoints.
So they see it as an infringement on free speech.
Exactly. They want to pull back the FBI's role in policing online speech.
Okay, so a more limited role for the FBI.
More focused on, actual crimes, less on thought policing.
Right, right. What else? What other changes do they want to see at the DOJ?
Well, they also want to prohibit the DOJ from entering into these settlement agreements that provide payments to third parties.
Okay, I'm not sure I follow.
So sometimes when the DOJ settles a case, they'll agree to pay money to, like, a nonprofit organization or something.
Oh, okay.
And the authors of this document, they see that as a way for the DOJ to funnel money to liberal groups.
Oh, I see. Like, they're using these settlements as a way to bypass Congress and fund their pet project.
Exactly. They want to put a stop to that.
Okay, so more accountability, more transparency.
That's a big part of their agenda.
Makes sense. Anything else on the DOJ?
They also advocate for tougher enforcement of immigration laws, making sure that the DOJ is actually prosecuting people who are in the country illegally.
Yeah. Okay, so we're back to immigration again.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme. They're very concerned about illegal immigration.
And they want to make sure the DOJ is taking it seriously.
Exactly. They believe that the current administration hasn't been doing enough to enforce immigration laws.
Okay, so a more hard-lined approach to immigration.
That's a good way to put it.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground with the DOJ. What else is on our agenda today?
Let's talk about the Department of Labor, the DOL.
The DOL, yeah, they're the ones who deal with worker safety and wages and all that, right?
Right, all things labor related.
Okay, so what do they want to do with the DOL?
Well, their vision for the DOL is one that's much less focused on regulation and much more focused on, fostering job creation and economic growth.
So a more business-friendly approach to labor policy.
Yeah, you could say that, but they emphasize that it's not about, rolling back worker protections.
Okay, so how do they square those two things?
They argue that you can have both. You can have a strong economy and protect workers' rights.
Okay, I'm listening.
They advocate for rolling back regulations that they see as burdensome, especially for small businesses.
Right, the whole red tape argument.
Exactly. They want to make it easier for businesses to operate, to hire people, to grow the economy.
Okay, that's a familiar argument. Anything else on the DOL?
They also want to see changes to the way the DOL defines joint employment.
Joint employment. Now that's getting into the weeds a bit.
I know. But it's an important issue for businesses, especially those that rely on, contractors or franchisees.
Okay, so how do they want to change that definition?
Well, they argue that the current definition is too broad, that it holds businesses unfairly liable for the actions of, people who aren't actually their employees.
Okay, I can see how that could be a problem for businesses.
Yeah, it can create a lot of uncertainty and legal risk.
So they want to narrow that definition to make it clearer who's responsible for what.
Exactly. They also want to see clearer rules governing what are called guidance documents.
Guidance documents. Okay, now we're really getting into the legal weeds.
I know, but these are important, even if they sound boring.
Okay, so what's the issue with guidance documents?
Well, basically, these are documents that agencies like the DOL use to, interpret and apply the law.
Okay, so they're not actual laws, but they have the force of law.
Kind of. And the authors of this document, they argue that the DOL has abused this power.
Oh, how so?
They say the DOL has used these guidance documents to impose new regulations without going through the proper rulemaking process.
So they're basically bypassing Congress.
Exactly. And that's something they want to stop. They want to make sure that any new regulations are subject to the scrutiny and approval of Congress.
Okay, so more checks and balances, more accountability.
Precisely. They also want to see changes to the way the DOL regulates worker retirement savings.
Retirement savings. Okay, what's the issue there?
Well, they're concerned about the DOL promoting what's called ESG investing.
ESG. Now that's a new one for me.
It stands for environmental, social, and governance.
Okay, and what's wrong with that?
Well, the authors argue that it's basically a way to push a liberal political agenda.
Oh, like forcing people to invest in companies that align with certain values?
Yeah, something like that. They believe that people should be free to invest their retirement savings however they want without the government telling them what to do.
Okay, so it's a free market argument, basically.
Exactly. They want to get the government out of the business of picking winners and losers in the investment world.
All right, so that's the DOL. What else is on our list today?
Let's talk about the Department of Transportation, the DOT.
The DOT, yeah. They're the ones who, deal with roads and bridges and airports and all that, right?
Right, all things transportation related.
Okay, so what do they want to do with the DOT?
Well, their vision for the DOT is one that prioritizes, safety, efficiency, innovation.
Okay, those are all good things.
Right. But they also want to see a DOT that's less bureaucratic, less bogged down in red tape.
So the classic streamlining argument.
Exactly. They believe that the DOT has become too focused on process and not enough on results.
Okay, I can see that being a problem.
It is, and they propose some pretty specific changes to address that.
Like what?
Well, for one, they want to separate the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, from the DOT.
Really? Why?
They argue that the FAA would be more efficient, more responsive if it wasn't part of this big bureaucratic department.
So give the FAA more autonomy.
Exactly. They also want to see the FAA embrace new technologies.
Oh, Like what?
Well, they talk about things like digital or remote towers, things that could help improve efficiency and reduce costs.
Okay, so a more modern, more tech-savvy FAA.
That's the idea. They also want to streamline the environmental review process for transportation projects.
Right, that whole getting permits and approvals thing.
Exactly. They argue that it's become too cumbersome, too time-consuming.
And that it's holding back, important infrastructure projects.
Yeah, they believe it's stifling economic growth and job creation.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a theme we've seen before with the Interior Department.
It is. They're very consistent in their belief that environmental regulations should not come at the expense of economic growth.
Right, right. Anything else on the DOT?
They also advocate for repealing the Jones Act.
The Jones Act. Now, that's a blast from the past.
It is. It's a law that's been around for almost 100 years.
And what does it do?
Basically, it requires that goods shipped between U.S. ports be transported on U.S.-flagged ships.
Okay, and what's wrong with that?
Well, the authors argue that it's a protectionist policy that drives up shipping costs and hurts consumers.
So they see it as an example of government interference in the market that's actually harmful to the economy.
Exactly. They want to get rid of it.
Okay, so that's the DOT. What's our last department for today?
Let's talk about the Department of the Treasury.
The Treasury, yeah, they're the ones who print money and collect taxes, right?
Right. They're basically the government's bank.
Okay, and what do they want to do with the Treasury?
Well, they envision a Treasury Department that's laser-focused on fiscal responsibility, sound monetary policy.
Okay, those are good things.
Right. And they also want to see policies that promote economic growth.
So the classic conservative agenda: lower taxes, less regulation, sound money.
Exactly. They argue that the government should be doing everything it can to create a favorable environment for businesses to thrive.
Okay, so how do they propose to do that?
Well, one of their big ideas is to reduce the regulatory burden on the financial industry.
So rolling back some of those Dodd-Frank regulations that were put in place after the 2008 financial crisis.
Yeah, exactly. They argue that Dodd-Frank went too far, that it's made it harder for banks to lend money and stifled economic growth.
Okay, so less regulation for Wall Street.
That's the idea. They also want to simplify the tax code, make it easier for businesses to comply with tax laws.
So lower taxes, less complexity.
Exactly. They believe that the current tax code is too complicated, too burdensome.
And that it discourages investment and economic growth.
Precisely. They also want to rein in the power of the Federal Reserve.
The Fed, yeah, that's always a controversial one.
It is. They argue that the Fed has become too powerful, too independent.
And that its actions have contributed to inflation.
Yeah, they're very concerned about inflation, and they want to see a Fed that's more focused on maintaining price stability.
So a less activist Fed, one that's more focused on controlling inflation and less on trying to stimulate the economy.
Exactly. They believe that the Fed should be more predictable, more transparent.
Okay, so a pretty significant change in how the Fed operates.
It would be. And it's a pretty controversial idea.
Yeah, I can see that. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have. We've talked about healthcare, housing, the environment, justice, labor, transportation, the Treasury.
Wow, it's like a whirlwind tour of the federal government.
It is. And we're not done yet.
There's more.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot more. Next time, we'll dive into some of the independent agencies like the FCC, the SEC, the FTC.
Oh, boy, those are some big ones.
They are. And they're often at the center of some pretty heated debates.
I can imagine. Well, I'm looking forward to it.
This could be good.
All right, stay tuned, everyone. We'll be back soon with more from Mandate for Leadership.
Don't miss it.
Okay, so we're back, and we're diving into the last part of our deep dive into Mandate for Leadership.
That's right. We've covered a lot of ground already, but there's still more to explore.
Yep, we've talked about some pretty major departments, but now I'm kind of curious about what they have to say about these, independent agencies.
The ones that fly a little more under the radar.
Exactly. I feel like they have a lot of power, but they don't always get as much attention.
Right, they're not always front page news.
Yeah, so where should we start?
Well, the FCC is always a good one to talk about.
The FCC.
The Federal Communications Commission.
Oh, right, the FCC. Yeah, they seem to be, constantly in the news for something.
It's a high-profile agency, for sure. It regulates a huge part of the economy.
Yeah, everything from, radio, TV to the internet.
Exactly. And it's an area that's constantly evolving, so there's always something new to fight about.
Right. So what do they want to do with the FCC?
Well, their big picture goal is to promote free speech, competition, and innovation.
Okay, those are all good things.
Right. But of course, the devil is in the details.
So what are the details? How do they propose to actually achieve those goals?
Well, one of their big concerns is the power of big tech companies.
Oh yeah, that's a hot topic these days.
It is. They argue that these companies have become too dominant, that they're stifling competition and innovation.
And they're worried about censorship, right? Like these companies silencing conservative voices.
Exactly. They want to see the FCC take a more active role in curbing the power of these tech giants.
So more regulation of big tech, that's kind of a shift for conservatives, isn't it?
It is, but it reflects a growing sense of concern, even among conservatives, about the power of these companies.
Yeah, I guess it's one of those issues that transcends traditional partisan divides.
It is. Now, beyond just reining in big tech, they also want to streamline the FCC's processes, reduce regulatory burdens.
So a more efficient FCC, less red tape.
Precisely. They believe that the FCC has become too bureaucratic, and that's hurting businesses, especially small businesses.
Okay, makes sense. Anything else on the FCC?
They also talk about spectrum management.
Spectrum. Now remind me what that is again.
It's basically the radio waves that wireless communications rely on.
Oh, right. So like cell phones, Wi-Fi, all that.
Exactly. And authors argue that the government needs to be more efficient in how it manages spectrum.
Okay, so less government control, more private sector innovation.
That's the idea. They want to see more spectrum freed up for commercial use.
All right, so that's the FCC. What about the FEC, the Federal Election Commission?
Oh, yeah, that's another one that's always in the news.
Always.
Yeah.
Campaign finance, it's such a mess.
It is, and the FEC is right in the middle of it.
So what do they want to do with the FEC?
Well, their main concern is that the FEC is being used to, target conservatives.
Oh, like they're using campaign finance laws as a weapon against their political opponents.
Exactly. They argue that the FEC needs to be reformed to protect free speech, to ensure that it's not being used to silence dissenting voices.
So a more neutral FEC, one that's not biased against one party or the other.
Exactly. They believe that the FEC should be focused on enforcing the law in a fair and impartial manner.
Okay, but how do they actually propose to do that?
Well, one of their key recommendations is to keep the FEC's current bipartisan structure.
Right, so you have an equal number of Democrats and Republicans on the commission.
Precisely. They argue that this structure is essential for ensuring fairness and preventing the agency from becoming too politicized.
Okay, so it's about checks and balances, making sure that no one party has too much control.
Exactly. They believe that any changes to the FEC's structure would just make it more partisan, more likely to be used as a weapon against political opponents.
Makes sense. All right, so that's the FEC. What's our last agency for today?
Let's talk about the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission.
The FTC, yeah, they're the ones who deal with antitrust and consumer protection, right?
Right. They have a pretty broad mandate.
Okay, and what do they want to do with the FTC?
Well, they actually question whether the FTC should even exist.
Whoa, really? They want to abolish the FTC?
Well, they suggest that its functions could be transferred to the Department of Justice.
Oh, I see. So they see it as redundant, basically.
Yeah, that's part of it. They also have concerns about the FTC's structure.
Oh, how so?
Well, they argue that the FTC commissioners aren't directly accountable to the president.
Right. They're appointed, but they don't serve at the pleasure of the president.
Exactly. And they see that as a problem, constitutionally speaking.
Okay. So they have some pretty fundamental concerns about the FTC.
They do. But even if they don't ultimately abolish it, they definitely want to see some reforms.
Like what?
Well, one of their big concerns is the use of guidance documents.
Guidance documents. We've heard that before, haven't we?
Yeah, it's a common complaint about agencies. They argue that the FTC has used these guidance documents to impose new regulations without going through the proper process.
So bypassing Congress, basically.
Exactly. And they want to put a stop to that. They want to make sure that any new regulations go through the proper channels, that they're subject to congressional oversight.
Okay, so more accountability, more transparency.
Exactly. They also want to limit the FTC's power to, bring enforcement actions.
So a less activist FTC.
Basically. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They want to make sure that the FTC is focused on its core mission of protecting consumers and promoting competition, but that it's doing so in a way that respects the rule of law and the limits of its authority.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've covered a lot of ground in these past 3 deep dives.
We have. We've gone through this entire Mandate for Leadership document, looked at their plans for everything from education to energy to the environment.
And it's clear they have a very specific vision for how they want to govern.
They do. It's a vision of a smaller, less intrusive government.
One that's more focused on individual liberty, free markets, and traditional values.
Exactly. And whether you agree with their vision or not, it's important to understand it.
Yeah, I mean, these are the ideas that are shaping the debate in Washington.
And they're likely to have a big impact on the future of our country.
So, as always, we encourage you to, do your own research, think critically about these issues.
Form your own opinions.
Exactly. Don't just take our word for it. And that's what the deep dive is all about.
Helping you make sense of the complex world we live in.
Exactly. So thanks for joining us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, stay curious.